Chicago police following another officer's suicide. Building a new museum, looking at the new Chicago Architecture Center from the ground up. Podcasters and radio producers descend on Chicago for the annual Third Coast International Audio Festival. Chicago and the immigrant experience as seen through the eyes of a 20th century artist getting his first show in nearly 70 years. And in the last 7 years of Aretha Franklin's life, her music director and conductor was a Chicagoan. Hear his stories about the Queen of Soul. All that and more next on Chicago Tonight. Thanks for joining us. I'm Phil Ponce. There is almost a full jury impaneled in the trial of a suspended Chicago police officer. Brandis Friedman has that story and more of what's making news in Chicago tonight. Brandis.
Phil, Chicago cop Jason Van Dyke will tell a judge tomorrow whether he wants a jury trial or a bench trial. Attorneys from both sides selected the 11th and 12th jurors today, but only 11 have been sworn in. Under Illinois law, the defense can request a bench trial before the 12th juror is sworn in, and Cook County Judge Vincent Gaughan is giving attorneys until Friday. In this racially charged case, the makeup of the 12-person jury breaks down this way. 7 are white with 3 Hispanic, 1 Asian American, and 1 African American. Van Dyke's attorneys have requested a change of venue, claiming pretrial publicity would prevent a fair trial. The judge still has not ruled on that request. The city's inspector general says the practice of allowing Chicago police officers to work in public schools as student resource officers, or SROs, needs an immediate overhaul. The IG's office says the police department and the school district have no legal agreement that lays out the roles and responsibilities of the officers while working in schools, only a police department general order, which was last updated in 1988. Among other suggestions, the office recommends formalizing the purpose of the SROs with a memorandum of understanding, as well as establishing hiring guidelines and training for officers and maintaining an updated roster of officers who are working as SROs. Now, a number of students and community organizations are responding to the report, calling on CPS to suspend the use of officers in schools pending a deeper analysis of their impact on students. The group argues the cops should be replaced with additional counselors and social workers. In a response, the school district says it has already taken drastic steps to reform the program, and more reforms are included in the city's new consent decree. Amanda Vinicky will have more on that in just a bit. And with less than 2 months until voters elect Illinois' next governor, the incumbent is making his pitch.
I underestimated how difficult change can be in government. You all know this truth. Spending more money we don't have and taking more money from taxpayers in hopes it will cover the bill will lead us to disaster. But you should know this as well. I have learned from my years on the job.
Giving a speech today at the Chicago Hilton, a humbled Rauner promised to be a different kind of governor if voters give him a second chance. Bruce Rauner says he was mistaken to demand an all-or-nothing conservative agenda in exchange for a state budget. It led to an infamous 2-year budget stalemate between Rauner and the General Assembly. His opponent in the November election, Democrat and fellow billionaire J.B. Pritzker, called the speech desperate.
Bruce Rauner thinks that he's got to reset or express, why it is that people need to change their minds and vote for him. He's obviously knows that people know that he's a failure for the last 4 years, and so he's got to try and find anything to grab onto to convince them otherwise.
And as for the weather, tonight mostly clear with a low around 61. Then tomorrow more sun with a high near 85. And no TV? No problem. You can get Chicago Tonight streamed on Facebook via podcast or the PBS video app, as well as online at WTTW.com/Chicago Tonight. Now, Phil, back to you.
Thanks, Brandis. It's not final yet, but it is close. A far-ranging consent decree that will govern how the Chicago Police Department operates has been finalized by Mayor Emanuel and Illinois Attorney General Lisa Madigan. Chicago Tonight's Amanda Vinicky is here with the story. Amanda, this is a big deal.
Yes, Phil, and it's notable that we're seeing this consent decree come to fruition just as that Van Dyke murder trial is getting underway. It was the release of a dash cam video that showed Van Dyke shooting teenager Laquan McDonald that prompted both citywide outrage as well as a probe of the CPD by the United States Department of Justice, and that is the basis for many of these reforms. We got a first glimpse of what CPD would be staring down in July when Illinois Attorney General Madigan and Mayor Emanuel presented a draft plan, since they reached a deal that requires tracking of every time an officer points a gun on someone, and members of the public submitted some 1,000 comments. That's all incorporated into the 230-page consent decree, which covers everything from police discipline to training of officers in schools.
For decades, Chicago has endured tragedies and heartache and failed attempts at real police reform. The resulting lack of trust between the public and the police is untenable, and it exacerbates a complicated violence problem. The consent decree gives us a unique opportunity to change that. It will support Chicago communities and police. It will build mutual trust and respect through effective policing that promotes safety in our city.
And yet this is not the final document. What is left to do? So
today, Madigan and Emanuel submitted this consent decree to the federal court. Members of the public will have another chance to weigh in, either in writing or by attending a fairness hearing at the end of October. Then U.S. District Court Judge Robert Dow will finalize the consent decree. Dow is also in charge of hiring an independent monitor who will be in charge then of actually making sure that CPD complies with all of the reforms. 9 people have applied for that job, and the public can check out their applications online and offer opinions on that too. The Fraternal Order of Police Union has filed suit seeking to intervene in that. FOP President Kevin Graham says the proposal interferes with the union contract. Graham says the consent decree is unnecessary and excessive and protects everyone except officers who put their lives on the line. Whenever it is finalized, Superintendent Eddie Johnson cautions it will take time to actually implement.
This consent decree will fundamentally change CPD and require a lot of effort, coordination, and investment. With that said, I also want to caution everyone that changing an organization of 14,000 total employees will take time. Despite our great progress in implementing reforms up to this point, it's important to recognize that we will not meet all of our goals overnight. But we have demonstrated our commitment to embracing every improvement with the strongest possible support.
Implementation's also going to be expensive. Additional training, tracking, and so on. Think $100 million or so. Mayoral candidate Lori Lightfoot previously pegged it at $10 million a year for the next 10 years as a low estimate. Now, Mayor Emanuel didn't have a hard number today. He says, though, that the current city budget incorporates the cost of police body cameras, and that we'll learn more when he incorporates this consent decree into his next final spending plan, which he'll propose next month. Emanuel says this is more than a dollars and cents equation, though.
Trust that you have between the rank and file and the residents, where you don't want them to just police, you want them to be a part of the community, not just to patrol it, but to be an integral part. That is a value that you just cannot put a dollar amount on, and that day in and day out will make the neighborhoods and the streets of the city of Chicago safer. And without it, you'll continue to have situations that actually incrementally deteriorate the trust between the police department and the people of the city of Chicago.
Still, though, paying for that implementation does stand to present a real challenge for a city that already is financially struggling.
The mayor leaves office in May, and what happens to the consent decree once the mayor's gone?
Well, it's not just him. Madigan, who helped to instigate this consent decree by filing a lawsuit, she's also not running for another term. But let's assume that this is finalized before they leave office. Either way, it's here to stay no matter who is next elected. That's what a consent decree is all about, court enforcement.
Amanda, thank you. And now to Eddie Aruza on a key component of the consent decree, improving mental health services for officers. Eddie.
Phil, the section in the consent decree is called Officer Wellness and Support, which addresses what it labels job-related stressors. One of the findings in last year's Department of Justice report on the Chicago Police Department was that the suicide rate among officers in Chicago is 60% higher than other departments across the country. That statistic has tragically played out this year, with 3 officers taking their lives over the last 2 months. The latest suicide occurred yesterday in the parking lot of the Calumet District Police Station on the far south side. That's the same location where another officer killed himself in early July. And with us tonight to discuss the mental well-being of police officers are former Chicago police officer Brian Warner, who previously served as chairman of the support group Chicago Police Survivors. Alexa James is the executive director of the National Alliance on Mental Illness Chicago, and she served on the mayor's Police Accountability Task Force. And Carrie Steiner is owner of First Responders Wellness Center, where she serves as a clinical psychologist specializing in the treatment of law enforcement officers. She's also a former officer with the Chicago Police Department. And we invited a current representative of the Chicago Police Department to join us, but they declined. Thank you all for being here tonight. Brian Warner, you can speak to the issue of mental health and mental wellness because you yourself underwent a trauma as you left the police department a few years back. Just briefly remind us what happened.
I did. I was involved in a shooting, which is uncommon in the police department, is not as common as people think. But after my shooting, you're mandated to receive one session with the clinician at the EAP, the Employee Assistance Program. My partner and I did that. We went there together. We had an hour session. We walked out of there. I realized that I probably could benefit from some more assistance. I took the card. I made some appointments, went back. After a handful of times, something very unprofessional happened, and I didn't go back. I self-medicated and just blew in the wind for several more months until somebody encouraged me to go back again and give it a second try with a different clinician. I did that as well, to no avail. It wasn't until I left the treatment of the EAP and went to a doctor outside the department who actually gave me a test, a written test, and examined me and diagnosed me with post-traumatic stress, that I started to recover.
Alexa James, when you were part of the task force following the DOJ report, that statistic seems to have gotten little attention at the time, and it was kind of buried in the report. But how much did the task force focus on mental health well-being for officers?
Well, I think the entire report focused on well-being of officers. I mean, the report was to make sure that officers felt equipped to do their job. I mean, these are professional officers. These are people who need all of the resources we can give them. We rely on them heavily, and they mitigate their physical injury every day. We should make sure that they're mitigating their emotional trauma as well. So I think it was a comprehensive look at officer wellness, or officer resources, certainly, and the focus on officer wellness, I think, was seen through. But note that, like, this has always been a point of advocacy, right? That we are working all the time to make sure that there's capacity building throughout all emergency responders so that they have access to mental health services. I mean, who is like seeing trauma like they are every day? I mean, this is a priority that we've been looking at for years and years.
But if we go by what Brian is saying and other anecdotal evidence, there is a lack of sufficient treatment and help for officers. Can you tell us a little bit more about the Employee Assistance Program, Carrie Steiner, because you are a former police officer who also underwent some trauma?
Yes, I did. I think the problem with officers getting help is because they have these fallacies that if they get treatment, that they will get fired or they will be removed from the job or have a fitness for duty, or that somehow something bad will happen. And unfortunately, I think that when I came on, the EAP and the peer support really gave out some information that was not factual. I know that one of the things that the EAP in Chicago feels very strong about is that they don't take notes, and that they feel very strong that come to us because we don't take notes and nothing can come of anything because it's all confidential. But the problem with that is that if some officers don't have a good experience there, then they don't feel like they have another place to go because they're scared that if they go somewhere else, that if somebody's taking notes, then that somehow will get me fired or I will lose my FOID card.
There's also not very many clinicians at the EAP, isn't that correct?
That is true. I believe there's 3 clinicians right now. And I think another problem is that they work one watch and there's 3 watches on the police department. So I think that the time frame is also not appropriate for the officers that are there. And one of the things that I know is really important to overall well-being is sleep. So if an officer who's working midnights has to stay up to be able to go and see a clinician, then that could be problematic because now they're going to be more tired. So,
Brian, you came onto the force more than 20 years ago, almost 25 years ago. What was the training in terms of psychological preparedness at that time?
For personal well-being, none. There were psych workshops that would put you in situations that would elevate your emotion and your adrenaline to see how you react to it, so you could learn from that. But after you walked out of there, there was a scenario where most of the people in this test were killed. An offender comes from behind a door and puts a gun to your head. And I was one of the few people who did not walk into this room because it was dangerous and I wanted to evaluate, and I stayed outside. But everybody else in the room was just sitting there because they realized this could happen in real life. So as far as that training, but how you cope with that the next day, because everybody was walking around like, this could happen, but again, no tools.
But they didn't have training to prepare you for something like that. So now with this consent decree filed in federal court and this being a key component of it, improving mental health well-being both before the officers begin their careers and as they need it throughout their careers, Alexa James, is this going to be a vast improvement over what Brian Warner experienced when he joined the force?
I do know that the recruits now are getting very different levels of training in terms of learning about, I was just talking to a sergeant yesterday, right? So they're doing like yoga for recruits and they're talking about how stress impacts our body and definitely taking a different approach from what it sounds like the experience was many years ago, which I think is critically important. And I think that that's right. Like we have to look at the entire person and make sure that as a professional organization that we're talking about wellness, right? This isn't just mental illness. This isn't just how are we responding when there's
it's
a
overall
critical
physical health wellness.
Absolutely. I mean, it all plays into their minds and their decision making on the street.
So, Carrie Steiner, what can you share with us now that you are a psychologist and you hear from law enforcement officials that come seeking help? What can you share with us about what they relay to you in terms of either stresses in their personal life or their professional life that is contributing to their mental health well-being?
I think that there's a lot of stress in their professional life because they feel like they can't do the police job without getting in trouble, and they feel that no matter...
In what ways specifically?
I feel that many of my clients feel that to be able to do their job, they want to be able to have the freedom to make decisions on the spot and not be questioned so much about it when they're trying to make a decision in just a couple of seconds. And it might be also a life or death situation. And a lot of people have a lot of time to sit on their couch and think about what happened and what they could have all done. But when you're in it, it's very fast. And the part of the body that takes over is really that fight or flight part of the body, and you can do some training to override that, but there's still an animal part in all of us that we're going to respond, and what's going to happen is going to happen.
But of course, that's what's led to this consent decree, not just here, but for example in Baltimore, and that's what's led to a lot of outrage that police officers aren't being held accountable at the same time that they have to make split-second decisions. So how do you respond to all of that, where you need exact training, at the same time you need to provide for their mental health well-being?
Well, I mean, I'm just a civilian, so I don't know what it feels like to be the police officer.
But as far as the task force that was analyzing this, what did you conclude?
We're in front of the police every single day. I have a tremendous amount of respect for them. And for this conversation, too, I want to make sure that we're thinking, too, about all emergency responders. This is not just a police department issue. This is the fire department. This is 911 call takers. They're dealing with terrible, terrible things. And every night that we report on the news that there's another tragedy, you know, look who's cleaning it up and look who's responding to that. So they have a lot of trauma to deal with. And they're managing their own life stresses. So how do we integrate integrate a system within the departments, within the different city agencies, that makes well officers and firemen and emergency responders so that they can do their job to the best of their ability. I think this is bigger than just how are we thinking about adding a few more clinicians. This is thinking about a really big cultural shift towards wellness and really prioritizing their wellness, just as we do, making sure that they physically get home at the end of the day.
Brian, is there something specific about Chicago, and maybe Chicago at this point in time, that is adding to the stresses? And I know that there's a lot coming from the FOP and the rank and file in terms of what the consent decree is calling for and limiting actions. But is it the culture in Chicago? Is it the extreme violence?
I think it's national. I think it started with the Ferguson effect, and police have been scrutinized, and it's been open season on police officers for many years now. We've lost the respect for the officer and empowered the gangbangers and the criminals. We need to switch that pendulum. But as far as going back to the well-being of officers, the city really needs to put together a full, fluid campaign to tell officers, number one, we have these resources for you. Build that infrastructure with enough clinicians, enough resources. Two, say it's okay to use it. Not is it okay, we want you to use it because we want you to be the best you can be for the police department, for the city, and for your family. And in the long run, I think we're going to save a life. I don't know that we can ever eliminate suicide. It's just prevalent in our culture, but we can certainly diminish it drastically.
Carrie, in August, Governor Rauner signed House Bill 5231, which is the Law Enforcement Support Program Confidentiality Act, which is, I think, something along the lines of what Brian is speaking to here. But can you give us some details of what that law provides?
So basically that means that if an officer does go and seek treatment and they were involuntarily committed, and usually they would lose their FOID card, and for most officers they have to have an FOID card to be able to work as a police officer. So therefore officers didn't want to go get treatment because if they did get involuntarily committed, they felt like they would automatically lose their job. So most people don't think of this as that, oh, should I go see a therapist or not, where officers have to think, should I go see a therapist or not, I could lose my job. And I think a lot of people don't understand how scary that is for an officer to get treatment. So what this law does is it helps officers to understand that if they go inpatient, that it's not a requirement any longer that they have to have their FOID card. And it's usually officers will be able to get that card back as long as they weren't an immediate harm to themselves or another person, and they have a clinician that would verify that.
So Alexa James, as this consent decree heads to federal court, and now there's still a period where the public can comment, is this going to make things worse for the police department in terms of the pressures on them as it's being implemented in the years to come?
I think it's how we talk about it. I think it's how leadership is talking about this document and how transparent the leadership is with officers about what's happening.
So what would you recommend to leadership about how they talk about this document, how it's presented?
I think that there's a real conversation about what implementation looks like. And I also think that we need to prioritize and support the officers throughout this process, because I can imagine it's a very, very scary time.
So Brian Warner, what do you say to police officers, young police officers entering the force, or rookies at this point, or really any of your fellow colleagues on the force, about seeking mental health assistance if they need it?
Well, right now there's obviously a stigma in our culture alone with mental health, but then also in law enforcement it's even tenfold, because we're the providers, we're the helpers, so it's difficult for us to ask for help. But we need to do that. But again, we kind of have to move away from putting the onus on the officer. The department has to step up and say, these are the resources, and even do some mandatory debriefings that we've talked about. There's been some horrific, multi-shootings and that entire family being killed in that home, where a couple of the bosses took it upon themselves and said, you know what, this is a special occasion, or this is just a so unique event that we need to have a debriefing. That probably happens 10 times a week, maybe more, where each and every one of those officers could benefit from a debriefing that we're just not doing.
Yeah, I don't think Chicago does any group debriefings, and that's very common, and I think that would help officers, and as well as doing the individual debriefing. And although I think that it is written in the general orders that they can do it, I think that it's very, very voluntary, and it's not an automatic. And I think that we need to start understanding that trauma, especially Chicago, compared to any other city, we are experiencing a lot of trauma. We have a lot of shootings here, and trauma is equal to unfortunately, problems with mental health. So if you're asking why are officers at so much of a higher rate in Chicago compared to other departments, I think it has a direct correlation to the amount of trauma that they're seeing. We need to make sure that they're understanding what that looks like and what they can do to help themselves, and we need to make sure
offers the resources for that.
Exactly.
Brian Warner, Alexa James, and Carrie Steiner, thank you all very much for being here tonight. And you can visit our website for a list of resources on suicide prevention. And there's more Chicago Tonight just ahead, so please stay with us.
Still to come on Chicago Tonight, it's been called the Sundance of Radio. Hear what's coming to the Third Coast Audio Festival. Industry in Chicago and old world traditions are rare. Man who was Aretha Franklin's music director in the last years of her life and at her funeral. But first, Center has moved into a spectacular and dramatic new space on East Wacker Drive, expanding its mission and its footprint on the city. Chicago Tonight was there on opening day for a first look at the center, a state-of-the-art museum that looks at buildings of Chicago and from around the world. Joining us are Lynn Osmond, she's CEO of the Chicago Architecture Center, and Kathy Tinker, she is a model from the Columbian Model and Exhibit Works. And welcome both to Chicago Tonight. Lynn Osmond, I was just at the center the other day, and it's extremely handsome and just dazzling. Why did you decide that you kind of had to go bigger than what you were?
Well, we celebrated 50 years and we were looking for what the next ambition was, and we knew that we had expanded far beyond our facilities, and the opportunity was to develop an architecture center which allowed us to both engage the public but also the profession.
And tell us about the new location, because it's a pretty impressive footprint.
It is an amazing location. You could not get anything better for an architecture center. It's right where Chicago was founded. It's in the last building designed by Mies. And then it's also right opposite our famous architecture river cruise on Chicago's First Lady. So for us, it's absolutely wonderful.
And here we're looking at an image taken from inside, and as we look at some of the models inside at the upper level, you actually look out on what it is the museum is addressing.
Yeah, it's fabulous because we look out over the Tribune, the Wrigley, these impressive city models. Then we also have these wonderful models inside, which we talk about Race to the Top, Chicago's role in innovation in skyscrapers.
Well, Kathy Tinker, you're a model maker is what I meant to say,
Yes.
if I didn't make that clear. And tell us about the greatly expanded model of the city center that you have that is displayed on the lower level at the center.
Well, happily, we've been working with Lynn for 10 years now. So they hired us in 2008 to make the first model, and now we've expanded it to almost twice the size. All of the buildings are drawn in the computer in 3D and then 3D printed. So we have to research and then draw every single building on the model.
So you draw it, but then your drawings are brought to fruition as 3D models using, I would imagine, some pretty slick technology.
It's called stereolithography.
What is it called?
It's called stereolithography, is the 3D printing method used on this model. So there's a big vat of acrylic resin, and laser beams shoot into it and solidify the resin to make it the shape that you drew in the computer. But it's a pretty specialized skill to draw every single building correctly so the 3D printer can print it.
I can imagine. And seeing this in person, it is just dazzling, because you went from 1,300 buildings to 4,200 buildings?
Yes, that's because it includes a lot of the south side, where you can imagine there may be 20 buildings on a block, as opposed to the city center where there's 1 or 2 buildings on a block. But yes.
And Lynn Osmond, the real skyline is always changing. So how do you account for that in terms of future changes to that spectacular model?
Well, we adjust it every 6 months. So we're, we have a great team at CAF. We're always at, at the Chicago Architecture Center.
Okay.
I have to adapt that name from the Chicago Architecture Foundation. But we have a great team. We're always ahead at looking at what the current projects are in the city. And so every 6 months, we actually update the model. So if anything, sometimes it's a bit futuristic, so that on the model you see that the Vista Tower is indeed finished when we only are at 75 stories, not
Close
at
enough.
101 yet.
Kathy, another interesting feature is the depiction of the Chicago fire. Tell us about the design of that.
I did not do that part. Lynn needs to talk about that.
Okay, fine. Lynn, tell us about that.
Well, we have this 8-minute video that talks about why Chicago is the city of architecture, and we have projection mapping that tells various stories, and one of them is that about the Chicago fire, so that you can actually see where the fire started and see the way it rippled across the city.
And what kind of feedback have you been getting from, particularly I'd be interested in people from out of state or people from another country?
You know, the first weekend was absolutely amazing with the diversity that we had, and we had people from all around the world, and we had an Indian wedding that was happening, so we had a lot of people from India. They were engaged with the program. They loved the model.
What, you had an Indian wedding at the center
No,
itself?
right opposite at the boat.
Oh,
And
I
so
see.
a lot of the people came to the center, and it was just exciting to see all these people engaging of all ages with the models, both upstairs in the skyscraper gallery, but also downstairs. A lot of professionals, architects, as well as visitors.
And the location, it's just steps from the boats themselves. Tell us about the connection between the two.
Well, it's great because, when you buy a ticket to the boat or to any of our other tours, that you get either a free ticket to the admission to the center or just a small add-on. So it's really a great way to kind of pair. In Chicago, we have great weather, but we also have poor weather, so it's nice to know that you can complement your experience with getting to know the city of architecture both inside and outside.
Kathy, one of the things that's impressive about it is that in addition to these models of skyscrapers and in addition to that fabulous depiction of the downtown and parts of the south side and so forth, there are also examples of vernacular architecture. Tell me about those.
We did make those models. There's different types of typical housing in Chicago, and it's timed, so it goes from workers' cottage to bungalow to courtyard building, and then finally one of the Mies high rises.
And Lynn, one of the things you told me when I visited is that people sometimes think, oh, I'm not around architecture if they live out in a neighborhood or so forth, but that's not really true.
And that's why we did that, because so many kids come to us and teachers come to us and say, we don't have architecture in our neighborhood. Well, it all starts at home. So that we like to say, might be where you live, or this is where your grandmother lives, and let's talk about architecture on a very personal level. And then it's not all about skyscrapers. It's about, those buildings that we live and work in.
Back to a little bit of history, Lynn, because the Chicago Architecture Center was founded in 1966. What exactly is your mission?
Well, our mission is to inspire people to discover why design matters. And so we were founded to actually save Glessner House, and that's when we were in the Chicago Architecture Foundation. And then with this move to the center, we became the center because we are a destination, but we're also the start for exploration of the city.
Kathy, in terms of the emotional satisfaction that you get from working on these models, tell us about that.
It's huge. I'm really proud of what I do, and
as a native Chicagoan particularly.
Exactly, and everyone who works for me is very proud as well. We worked for 6 months straight on the expansion, and like I said, we've been working on this for 10 years, so it's fun for me. For many people don't really understand what we do, and now they can see exactly what we do.
Lynn, who's this geared to? Because I would imagine that in addition to tourists, probably some real-life architects come through.
Oh, I mean, we have a great variety, so I think there's something for architects. We have 27 different models in our skyscraper exhibit, and we've had architects from around the world contribute models, so there's something that's really interesting to see, this model mania. But then there's also, for the public, there's an awe and wonder of the space and of seeing these incredible scale models on the skyscraper gallery, or also, of course, getting to know the city in the Chicago City of Architecture exhibit.
What is it that you would like for people to take away from the experience of encountering these models, of learning about architecture in the city and around the world?
I think there's two things. There's one is to get to know the city of Chicago and why architecture is so important and why it's a defining moment, and understand the importance of the built environment. Then in the skyscraper gallery, I think it's really important for us to understand the role of innovation that's happened here in Chicago that we're now spreading all over the world with our architecture.
Lynn Osmond, Kathy Tinker, thank you both for being here. Very much appreciated. Congratulations on the opening.
Thank you.
And back with more right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Allstate. Allstate is investing in Chicago's youth. We believe good starts young. That's why we're helping our youth develop the skills they need to achieve success in life. Allstate is proud to empower the next generation of leaders.
In case you haven't heard, we're in the midst of a radio revolution. Podcasts, those radio programs available on demand, are exploding in popularity. And every year, Chicago becomes the epicenter of the podcast world during the Third Coast International Audio Festival. Now in its 17th year, the festival attracts audio producers from around the world. This year's event runs from October 1st through the 12th. Here to tell us what to expect at this year's festival and share her thoughts on changes on how people tune into radio is Third Coast Audio Festival founder and executive director Joanna Zorn. Joanna, welcome back to Chicago Tonight.
Hi,
so good
Phil.
to see you.
Thank you.
So you started this audio festival back in 2001 when you were a producer for WBEZ Radio. What was your vision for it?
Well, I was hearing such magnificent work being made, and there really wasn't a home for it. And I wanted to create a home. I was very inspired by Sundance and thought, why isn't there a festival of audio storytelling, of audio documentary? It felt like a big vacant hole. And when I thought about it, one reason is because radio was always thought of as kind of ephemeral. It's here today, it's gone tomorrow. You turn on the radio in your car, you catch the middle of the story or the end of the story, but the idea that you always catch the whole arc of something and that it's there to go back to when you want to, it didn't exist. But the internet had just, started being a place where that could happen. So it was perfect timing to start Third Coast.
When was the first time you heard the word podcast?
Well, I know that our first session on podcasts at the Third Coast Conference, which is this gathering of like hundreds and hundreds of makers from around the world coming up this fall, I know that our first session was in 2004. And everyone was really confused. The session was called Podcasting Believe the Hype, and everyone was really confused. You're like, it's on your iPod, but like, how does it get on your iPod? And it was just like a rash of confusion. But eventually it settled out. I was like, oh, like you're like your own person. You can make this. You don't have to go to the person who's the gatekeeper at the public radio station and say, I want to do a show. No, you can make a show and you can get it directly to people's ears. And the growth of podcasting has been slow. That was 2004. It was really until I think it's 2013, 2014 that Serial came along, and then it exploded.
And for people who don't know, remind people what Serial was.
Serial was a limited series, an investigative piece that came out of a series that came out of the folks from This American Life, Sarah Koenig, and they looked into a single case of a man who was behind bars, Adnan Syed, and wondering whether he really committed the murder of his ex-girlfriend. And there were, everyone was on Reddit trying to figure this out.
It became a phenom.
It was a phenom. Everyone said to me, have you heard it? And that had never happened in radio ever before.
So what has happened in the post-Serial world in terms of the boom in podcasts, that is?
Well, I think people were inspired because they thought, well, people will, and honestly, turn off their TV. Sorry, I don't mean to put down television in any way, but just
no offense taken in the context of this conversation.
Thank you, none intended. That it could be as captivating, and you could binge listen to it, and other people heard that and realized, oh, there is some potential here that we haven't even begun to mine yet, and so it just started. I mean, it was building slowly, as I say, but that's where it just went boom. And there are a lot of true crime podcasts that came along, still are, but people started experimenting in all different kinds of ways to create really different and varying and gripping work.
Another thing that, one of the things you alluded to is that radio was, you described it as once thought of as being ephemeral. But now with podcasts, it isn't quite as ephemeral because you can re-listen to something, you can pause it and listen to it the next day. It really is an on-demand audio experience. What are some of your favorite podcasts?
Well, we talked about this before we got on, that that I'm still a really big fan of This American Life. And This American Life predated us by a couple of years. It was one of the programs that made me feel like there is something here that is just not being recognized and not being mined and appreciated and honored in the way it should be. So I still love This American Life, and their really timely journalism is really, really strong. Jada Barad, I don't know if you know of his work. He's done a series called More Perfect about the Supreme Court decisions, which should seem kind of dry and full of details and not super captivating, but it really, really is.
I have to interject here, and because those podcasts that you mentioned are associated with big organizations, and so they have resources. But what is the business model for podcasters?
Well, it really varies. So you've got everyone from your passion project people who are making really next to no money. They're doing this on the side, and maybe if anything it gets them a job in podcasting, and then they can still continue to do it. To all the way on the other end of the extreme, you have the folks at Gimlet Media who do branded podcasts for organizations like Trader Joe's or whatever, and they are it's very, very lucrative through.
So it runs the gamut.
It really does.
What are some of the highlights for this year's gathering?
Well, you're right. It is a gathering. It's like two gatherings in one. One gathering is an industry gathering of makers who are there to raise their skill level, meet potential collaborators, talk about issues that are important in the world of making audio storytelling. And then layered on that are live events. We have 4 listed. It's called the Fest 2017, and we have 4 events listed so far. We have 3 more to come, but they also range a wonderful gamut, and they will fill venues all around Chicago. 30 for 30 from ESPN does a podcast, which is amazing. Terrible, Thanks for Asking, which is a show about emotions and feelings and tough parts of life, which is great. Imaginary Advice, which is a fanciful experimental show by Ross Sutherland of Scotland. And then we're doing a fully bilingual show with the woman who does the Duolingo podcast, Martina Castro.
Joanna Zorn, thanks for giving us a preview of what's happening with this year's festival. Good to see you.
I hope to see you there.
Again, the Third Coast International Audio Festival runs from October 1st through the 12th, and there is more Chicago Tonight just ahead, so stick around.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part through the generous support of the Julius Frankel Foundation.
An important Chicago artist is getting his first solo exhibition in nearly 70 years. Todros Geller was an immigrant artist who captured both the old country and his new adopted home. Chicago Tonight visited on opening day of the exhibition called Strange Worlds. He depicted traditional scenes of Jewish life in Eastern Europe and Chicago industry in the early 20th century.
He kind of straddled these two worlds. He was in the Jewish world, the traditional world. He was also in the world of modernist artists. We often see in his work these kinds of contrasts between youth and age, between secular and religious, and that's really the essence of his work.
As an adult, Todros Geller moved from Ukraine and the Russian Empire to Montreal. In Chicago, he set down roots and studied at the School of the Art Institute.
He was really a master printmaker, but he did beautiful oil paintings, he did watercolors, he did designs for stained glass windows, he did all kinds of things. He was a really versatile and inventive and interesting artist.
Known as the Dean of Chicago Jewish Artists, Todros Geller taught at Hull House, and his influence extended to other immigrant communities. And he traveled to the American Southwest and painted sensitive depictions of Native Americans. He also worked for the WPA and sympathized with the labor movement.
The artists who worked on the WP often considered themselves laborers. Geller particularly had a very, very powerful sense of connection to workers and a very powerful sense of social justice, and felt that his art could make change. There's a term in Judaism called tikkun olam. It means repair of the world. And this was a very, very powerful idea in his work and the work of other artists, other Jewish artists at the time.
Geller had an ambitious plan to document Jewish art.
He was convinced that there was a long history of Jewish art, which we know there was. But at that time, people really didn't think Jewish people made art. And he went on a trip to find Jewish art with the intention of coming back to the United States and starting a museum of Jewish art. He went to Europe, he went to Paris, he finally ended up in Palestine.
Geller's Museum of Jewish Art never came to be. Back in Chicago, he taught at the College of Jewish Studies. That college became the Spertus Institute, which is now presenting the first solo show of Geller's artwork since his death in 1949. It is part of the year-long art and design initiative by the Terra Foundation for American Art. Throughout many of his works, one can catch glimpses of Chicago.
And there's this contrast between this old world person and this fabulous new modern city that Geller lives in. And he combines these things, straddles these things, and tries to deal with these things, I think, all through his career.
A scholar once wrote that Todros Geller's work was like the Talmud read to the rhythm of the elevated train. The exhibition is called Strange World. It just opened at the Spertus Institute. There's more to see on our website. Along with the eulogies at Aretha Franklin's funeral, there were also 20 musical performances from legends like Stevie Wonder, Chaka Khan, and Gladys Knight, to current stars like Ariana Grande, Faith Hill, and Jennifer Hudson. Behind them was a full orchestra choir. The 8-hour performance required not one but 2 music directors, including our next guest. Fred Nelson III was Aretha Franklin's music director, and you just saw him right behind Jennifer Hudson. He was Aretha Franklin's music director and conductor until from 2011 until her death. They performed together more than 200 times. Fred was born and raised in the Chicago area. He was a musical prodigy and toured with Ray Charles when he was 6 years old. Fred Nelson, welcome to Chicago Tonight.
Thank you, Phil.
We'll get back to Ray Charles in just a bit, but first, okay. I understand that the first time you conducted for Aretha Franklin, you thought afterwards she might never work with you again. What happened?
Well, it was a very tight stage that night, and she had a small, train, maybe about 8 to 10 inches on the back of her dress. So she was literally maybe a foot away from me. So I'm conducting, I'm doing with the band. All of a sudden I feel this shove in the arm. And it was like, uh-oh. And she says, "You're standing on my dress." So I said, okay. So I said, well, this is the first and last performance, but she sent me a letter shortly after and said, perfect, great job. So I said, okay, let's move on.
So you started working her in 2011, and you worked with other big names, but this was Aretha.
Mm-hmm.
And let's take a quick look of her performing in her heyday.
All right.
So early on, when you started working with her, were you nervous about it?
Not real nervous, but I did want it to go well. This is the creme de la creme, the best that there is, and the queen. And of course, you want to do your best because you want her to call you back. And so I was a little nervous, but I had good help. The pianist had prepped me for the job, and so we were good, and I enjoyed it, but it was work, So.
I've read about her that she was a pretty demanding boss. Can you give me an example? First of all, is that true?
Very true. And when it came to our shows, one of her favorite statements to me was, "Fred, on the one. We got to be on the one."
What does that mean?
excellence.
Oh, I see.
On the one. And she would say, and if we did well, she'd say to me after the show, Fred, you were on the one tonight. If I didn't do well or we missed something, could be an ending, what were you doing?
So she was very detail-oriented.
Oh, very detailed. And, you know, something as simple as a crystal ball that we had in a show that wasn't big enough, and I said, oh, my, you know, maybe she forgot about it. The very next show, she said, Fred, make sure the crystal ball is large enough.
Oh my gosh! So, is there a particular performance that stands out? Here you are with Aretha Franklin.
Okay.
Is there a particular performance that stands out as you were really on the one, or a performance when you were not on the one?
You know, yeah, I'll go with the positive.
Okay.
I'll go with the better one. Our last show, one of our last shows, was in Philadelphia. Her voice was strong. She just blew the house away. The band was like tight. And that will be probably my favorite show, you know, with her. And it was the one before Elton John. And that night was kind of tough. In fact...
Why was it kind of tough?
Well, because at the very last minute, and she was good for this, even whether it was on stage or not, she changed the set list just like that. And she called me off stage. I was getting ready to hit the band with the overture, and she says, Fred, come here. She said, this set list isn't right. So I'm not going to say it's not. So I said, okay, well, tell me, Ms. Franklin, what you want to do. Well, one of those songs was a track, and I didn't get a chance to get to the sound guy. So we're standing there waiting for this track to start, and, you know, it didn't happen. So after the show, she says, Fred, I'm going to fine you tonight $100 for letting me stand there. And she did.
She really did fine you.
I mean, it was humorous to me, but she waited to the very last show to do that, and so she didn't care. You know, this is, you know, business.
So talk about the funeral, because it was 8 hours long, and I understand that Gladys Knight was sort of booked as the thing was happening. She was added during the show.
That day, and this was one, and so I had just finished playing for Stevie Wonder. And I'm just kind of sitting at the keyboard at that moment. It's the only time I played all night. And all of a sudden I see Gladys.
Excuse me, who's that that we're looking at right now?
That's Gladys.
That's Gladys Knight?
That's Gladys
okay,
Knight.
I didn't recognize her with those glasses.
I know, and I didn't either at first. And she walked past me, and the person who escorted her on stage just gave me a key, said D flat. So I have no idea what she's going to sing, and I just, and then finally I just listened. And it was a good thing I recognized the song.
What was the song?
I think You'll Never Walk Alone. I think that's
see.
what it was. And then she went into, I think, Bridge Over Troubled Water, something like that. Yeah.
I see. So you really had to be on and flexible.
Yeah.
But back to Aretha Franklin, you really became friends, and you would have long conversations on the phone.
Oh,
what would you talk about, for example?
Mostly politics.
Politics?
She loved to talk about politics, yes. And the night Barack was, got the nod for the presidential candidate for the Democratic Party, we were on the phone like an hour and 45 minutes. And here's the thing that happened when they announced it, her song, they started playing her song in the convention center, Respect. And I said, there you go. And,
what was her reaction to that happening?
You know what? She didn't get like overly excited. She was like, all right now. And that was it.
Did she, her voice has been described as, you know, once in a lifetime voice. Was she aware that, I mean, clearly she must have been aware of her instrument and just how special it was?
You know what? I'm not so sure. It came from a very special place inside of her, and I'm not so sure she really felt like she was doing the work. You know, she came out of church, and it didn't matter whether she was doing Nessun Dorma, which she sang for Luciano Pavarotti. It all came from the same place. And she would just, and most times you see her sing, her eyes are closed. That's because she has shut everything else out around. And it came from that special place, so.
Listen, let's get back to something at the beginning of the conversation that has to do with Ray Charles. You were touring with him when you were 6 years old. What were you doing on the road with Ray Charles?
I was his opening act, believe it or not, for a year, at least a year and a half to 2 years.
Are you that young man in the picture?
That's me.
You were his opening act.
Yeah.
But you were playing the organ at the time.
Yes.
Do you remember the kinds of tunes that you played?
Oh, things like If I Had a Hammer, Watermelon Man, you know, things that were kind of popular in the jazz genre at that time, and yeah, those kinds. And Donald Byrd was my arranger, believe it or not.
No kidding.
Yeah.
And how long would you perform when you opened for Ray Charles?
Probably, now, I'm 6 years old.
Right.
I don't have a lot of memories here. The only thing, probably 15, 20 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the only thing I ever remember, we were at Riverfront Stadium. I remember running around the Met Stadium as a kid. That's the memory I have, probably, but, you know, yeah.
What will your lasting memories be of your time with Aretha Franklin?
Our conversations, how, you know, she could just shift, but probably my biggest memory would be excellence, you know, and how she strived for it, and she never let us forget that as her support system, you know, and you better get it right, and you know, and she had a huge heart, She did things behind the scenes for people, you know. For instance, she rented out 2 hotels during the Flint water situation, and all you had to do was show up at the hotel and show your driver's license, and she paid for all the rooms. You know, things like that. She was sweet as can be, you know, really in a big way, and I'll miss that, you know. Yeah.
Fred Nelson, thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
sharing your reflections on Aretha Franklin.
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. Thank you. And that is our show for this Thursday night. Stay connected by signing up for our daily e-alert. And please join us tomorrow night at 7 for the Weekend Review. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Phil Ponce, and I thank you for watching. Good night.
Closed captioning for this program is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, pleased to give back to the community through numerous charitable initiatives.